What if everything you thought you knew about someone was a lie? What if a person trusted to heal and protect was a predator? And what if, for decades, no one believed the truth, no matter how much evidence you provided? That's the story of Galina Trefil, or at least that's the story she's telling. When I first came across her post, I was immediately drawn in. It wasn't just the horrific nature of her claims, but the level of detail she was providing. She's naming law enforcement officers, sharing emails, presenting official records from the medical board, and insists her father, Jon Trefil, was not only a predator, but a serial killer, one who enabled other murderers and evaded justice for decades. And at first, I was open to the possibility, what if she's telling the truth? What if she had spent her life trying to get people to listen? But of course, with all things, as you keep digging, more questions emerge. I found another Facebook page where Galina talks about being a writer and a rabbi. And of course, that alone doesn't discredit her, but it does raise the possibility. Is this a real-life horror story? Or could this be groundwork for a book, a social experiment, or something else? And then there's her husband, a man who was convicted and sent to prison. There was a home invasion, a robbery, and a murder. And he wasn't alone, but in any case, was it just a robbery that went wrong, or does it connect to something else? I don't know. The deeper I look, the more I realize there are only two possibilities. Either this is one of the most shocking crime stories in modern history, a case of massive failure by law enforcement and a plea for long overdue justice, or it's something else entirely, a fabricated narrative, an attempt at something bigger, and a mystery of a different kind. If it's true, the victims deserve justice, and these families deserve answers. And if it's false, then we have to ask why. Why create this? Why put it out there? So in this video, I'm presenting Galina's first statement that she made, exactly as she wrote it. But as I do, I'll be breaking it down and questioning some of the gaps and asking some of the hard questions. This is part one of a case that could change a lot of things, or could be something we've never seen before. I am Galina. I am the daughter of a serial killer, and I need your help. That is a bold opening statement. She's not suggesting her father might have done bad things. She's flat out saying he was a serial killer. She needs help, implying this is an ongoing issue. When someone leads with a claim this bold and strong, you have to ask yourself, what proof do they have? What is driving them to make such a public statement? Dr. Jon Charles Trefil, serial killer, my father, was in so many ways an extremely lonely person. He was shy, introverted, and almost completely, with only a handful of exceptions, unable to make or sustain friendships. He desperately craved long-term bonds, though very much wanted a co-killer. Over the course of his 30 years of being a doctor, he was always on the lookout for one. As the former assistant chief psychiatrist at San Quentin and a psychiatrist for Lake County Jail, he was certainly in a position to find one. He sought out and treated thousands of murderers and rapists. So here, she paints a psychological portrait of her father, that he was socially isolated, that he was desperate for connection, and specifically looking for a co-killer. The last part is an accusation. How does she know this? Did her father tell her that directly? Did she find documents confirming that? Or did she interpret this? And here's an important fact. His work history is real. He did work at San Quentin State Prison and Lake County Jail, and he did treat murderers and rapists. So we can confirm his job put him in the position to do what she's describing. But what we cannot confirm yet is whether he actively sought out a partner to kill with. She goes on to say, "There were two other serial killers that he told me about, Michael Fries and Julia Sternad Hauser, who were never caught. Both were his patients. Both would have been caught if not for his help." So now we have two names. Michael Fries, allegedly a serial killer who was never caught, and Julia Sternad Hauser, a woman who allegedly murdered multiple people, possibly with Dr. Trefil's help. At this point, I am searching for criminal records, missing person reports, or news articles connecting any of these names to any crime whatsoever, but nothing has come up. And that doesn't mean that they aren't real people, but it does mean that if they were serial killers, no one ever publicly looked at them or documented it in that way. That's where Galina needs to provide some evidence. Were there police reports on either of them? Did anyone else suspect them of being murderers? Did Jon help cover up specific crimes? She goes on. "I met Julia Sternad when I was about 8 years old, circa 1989. My mother had separated from my father and I, and in her absence, Jon became severely unhinged. We lived alone, he and I, in the seclusion of his 18.5-acre property in the Redwood Forest, located in Albion, California. One day, Jon told me that he had a special job for me. He had a new patient that had multiple personality disorder. And with some of the personalities being children, he wanted me to come into his office and play with her, so he could observe the child personalities playing with another little girl. He praised me so much for doing this. He called me his little psychiatrist. He warned me, though. The doctor-patient confidentiality was sacred, and if I ever told anyone what was said during therapy, I would go to prison for many years. The patient I met and played with was Julia." So here we move into personal experience. She claims her father directly involved her in Julia's therapy. He allegedly used her to interact with Julia's child personalities, and he threatened her with prison if she ever told anyone. This is very disturbing, and some parts can be verified. At this point, her story hinges on her personal testimony, but as we go further down this road, there are documents to prove that Galina, who's also at some points known as Mimi, was involved in Julia's therapy. She goes on. "Very soon after meeting her, Julia began staying the night at our house in Albion 3 or 4 times a week. Her relationship with my father was grotesquely sexual and resulted in me being subjected to physical, sexual, and psychological abuse. I will never forget the time at a burn pit in our backyard. Julia started taunting me that she would burn my chihuahua alive in front of me. It was her hobby to capture local pets, torture them to death, and hang them from trees. I began screaming hysterically. My father broke off a tree branch in response, and I was beaten. Julia sat by giggling. When it was over, I was so incredibly relieved because my beating distracted Julia from the prospect of killing my dog." Now, this is horrific. Julia allegedly lived with them multiple nights during the week. She was sexually involved with Jon. She abused Galina. She tortured animals. So this is where we would ask, did any neighbors ever see her there? Were there any cruelty reports? Did Galina tell any teachers, friends, or social workers? I don't know, but I have a feeling she's going to tell us. Julia probably told me she would murder me 100 times at least. She also repeatedly threatened to murder my mother. My mother became so afraid of her that despite being a 4th grade teacher in Fort Bragg, she began carrying a loaded gun to school and keeping it in her classroom desk. Let's pause here for a second. Think about the level of fear a person must have to carry a gun into a classroom, risking their job, reputation, and maybe even criminal charges. This is not normal behavior for a school teacher. It suggests, if true, Galina's mother was genuinely terrified of Julia. But here's the thing. She was afraid of an unstable, violent woman, or was she afraid of a serial killer? Because if we believe what Galina's saying, Julia's not just violent. She was an active murderer. She goes on to say, "My mother was afraid because Julia, almost from the word go, spoke in detail of being an uncaught serial killer. According to her, she had murdered for the first time as a teenager, living in Southern California. For several years, she lived and murdered in Lake County and then continued in Mendocino County. Some of the victims were stabbed to death with a special knife, which my father has admitted on tape that he took from her and disposed of in the Albion River, just in case it had DNA on it. Some of the victims, trafficking victims, were only children." So this is where it gets more disturbing. Galina is saying her father not only knew that Julia was a killer, but helped her cover up evidence, literally throwing a potential murder weapon in the river. So this is where real life unsolved cases could come into play. Could any of these victims match real missing person cases from the Mendocino Lake County area? Could there be bodies that were found but never connected to Julia Sternad? 2 unsolved cases come to mind. Wanda Lee Brewer, between 77 and 79, her remains were found near the Lake and Mendocino County line, exactly where Julia was allegedly active. She was confirmed via DNA decades later, but her killer's still never been caught. The timing does fit Julia's known timeline. Could she have been one of her victims? Then you have Carrie Graham and Francine Trimble in 78. The 2 girls disappeared. They were young, which Julia allegedly targeted. Their bodies were found near Highway 20 in Mendocino. Once again, a location Julia had access to and claimed to have murdered in. Could she have been involved in their disappearance and murder? Galina's words. "Many of the victims in Lake and Mendocino County were almost entirely very elderly men. Julia worked as a caregiver, often under the table. She would come into private family homes, and when entrusted with the care of patients unable to manage themselves or sometimes even speak due to strokes, she sexually abused them, denied them their medication, and or overdosed them. She never said any of their names, but she did claim to have worked at the Sherwood Oaks Retirement Facility in Fort Bragg, California. She also told me many times about how one particular very frail old man was laid down so that she, a 300-pound woman, sat on his chest until he died. My mother did go to the Fort Bragg Police Department to report Julia's serial killer claims. There is a report of that visit, and my father also kept a record of the police officer's name that told her that while he believed Julia was claiming to be a serial killer, he could not investigate it based on her lack of saying the victims' names. The officer acknowledged that Julia was a known pedophile with a rap sheet. She had also been married to a Dale Sternad, who had been killed in a shootout after murdering a CHP officer. Still, nothing happened. Sternad was not even questioned. That same Fort Bragg cop later took a job as an investigator for the Mendocino County DA's office. As a teenager, I began to be aware of just how bizarre my situation was. I was a minor facing down a child killer. Why was no one helping me? Why was the Fort Bragg PD not helping? My sense of despair intensified when Julia accused my father of rape to the California Medical Board. That investigation lasted years, and I thought, aha, someone will save me now. My father had me copy Julia's patient files for the medical board, wherein I saw Julia put in writing her intention to kill me. Surely the medical board would save a 16-year-old girl. But they too did nothing. In the middle of the night on my 17th birthday, as I slept on the living room couch, I awoke to the sound of the front door being jostled. I heard Julia speaking with a man on the front porch. This was it. She had come to murder us, me and my mother, and had the knife to do it. She just couldn't get inside. I hit the floor and crawled into my parents' room. I said what was going on, but my mother's speech was slurred. I think she had been drugged. She couldn't get out of the bed. As Julia continued to try to break into the house through the back door, I got a gun and hid behind a couch. I didn't want to die, and I didn't want my mother to die either. I don't know about my mother, but I know that Jon had taken out a very high life insurance policy on me. If I died, he got rich, very rich. I stayed up all the rest of the night, gun in hand to protect the two of us, and then got ready for school the next day, very much aware that I couldn't tell anyone that I'd almost been stabbed to death the night before. I did tell one person, my boyfriend, but what could he do? That's one of the most chilling moments in Galina's account so far. Imagine being a teenager waking up to someone actively trying to break into your home to kill you. Her mother was slurring like she was drugged. A known violent predator was outside trying to get in, and she couldn't tell anyone. That's not paranoia, that's survival mode. The fact that she says she armed herself shows she fully believes she was about to be killed. And the life insurance policy, was that a coincidence, or was there a reason that Jon had taken it out on her? This is where things start to blur. If Galina is exaggerating or making this up, why would she include details that could be verified, like the existence of a life insurance policy? Galina's words. During the rape investigation, Julia suddenly died. Using his influence as a doctor, my father immediately got a copy of the autopsy and death certificate. He also bought a cake to celebrate. A serial killer suddenly dying during a rape investigation. If Julia was as unhinged as Galina described, did she kill herself to avoid going to prison if these things were being reported? Or was her death not an accident? And Jon's reaction, he celebrated and bought a cake, and he got the autopsy and death certificate. Was he happy because his abuser was dead, or because she couldn't testify against him if this went further? My father informed the medical board that she was dead and they could stop investigating him. Well, they didn't. Dead or not, the investigation moved forward, and Jon was ultimately stripped of his medical license. This is a concrete piece of evidence in Galina's story. If Dr. Trefil lost his medical license, this means the investigation found something serious enough to revoke it. What exactly was uncovered? We're going to go over that. Galina does include many pages of this report in her postings, so we will read that. Galina's words. As I grew older, I just assumed that documents that I'd copied for the medical board must have been later removed by him. There was no way so many adults who had the legal responsibility to protect a child could have had long-term looked the other way. If they'd only helped me, I wouldn't have to have gone through that murder attempt at 17. This is where being frustrated turns into outrage. She was a minor, and multiple adults were allegedly aware that a known child predator was threatening her. A woman had confessed to multiple murders, and a doctor was helping to cover all of this up, yet nothing happened. She believed for years that those documents had simply been erased, but now she says they still exist. And why did they ignore her? Was it incompetence? Who at the medical board knew about Julia and did nothing? Galina's words. When my father, so many years later, gave me his diary collection, he had an entire box on Julia. It was beyond devastating to read that the California Medical Board and so many doctors absolutely did know about Julia's claims of being a serial killer. And they also knew that my life, a child's life, was specifically being threatened. They knew, and they left me there in those circumstances to die. Let's take a second to let that sink in. Galina is claiming that multiple licensed doctors, officials, and board members knew, without a doubt, that a woman was confessing to being a serial killer, and a child, Galina, was being threatened. And they didn't do anything. That's not just neglect, that's complicity. If doctors knew Julia was dangerous, why didn't they do something more? Perhaps they didn't believe her confessions, but to just choose to ignore them, that's complete incompetence. Galina's words. To this day, if I were ever in a room with those doctors, all that I would want to know is why. Why? Did I deserve to die? Didn't I deserve to live? Didn't I deserve not to be subjected to a pedophile? How could you ignore this? That part is heartbreaking. A child forced to live in fear, knowing that adults who were supposed to protect her didn't do anything. And she wasn't just overlooked, she was abandoned. And it raises serious ethical concerns about the medical board and mandated reporting. I suppose they assumed Julia was lying because of her mental capacity. But did they protect Dr. Trefil because he was a respected psychiatrist, or did they just not care? Galina's words. I was also aghast to learn that Julia, a regular member of the Fort Bragg Kingdom Hall, had been assigned a spiritual guide of sorts. I don't remember the exact title the woman had. This woman, whose name is also recorded by my father, was present during a therapy session in which Julia graphically described murdering a baby girl that she had given birth to, but never registered with the state. How could any adult listen to what Julia did to that baby and not turn the information over to the police? But she didn't, and Julia kept attending the Kingdom Hall up until she was finally tossed out, not for child murder, but for getting drunk and for streaking in town. Every single agency that could have brought Julia to justice failed. Probably because of the concept of a female sex killer in the 90s was so utterly bizarre. Regardless, they all failed. And Jon kept all the records of that failure. The names, the dates. He held on to it all. Now that's a damning statement. It speaks to a larger systematic failure, just beyond one case. Galina is suggesting the idea of a female serial killer was so unheard of that authorities simply didn't take it seriously. And that's not a missed opportunity if true, it's repeated negligence. And Dr. Trefil documented every failure. Why? Was it for leverage? Protection? We don't know. It's disturbing to consider that a doctor with extensive records of a self-confessed murderer never used them to bring her to justice. Galina's words. As proof of this story, I enclose below copies of the reports from the California Medical Board, along with a photograph of myself and another child and Julia in a bra and panties, swimming in the backyard pond on Jon Trefil's Albion property. I have these documents now, and this is where Galina presents physical evidence. The official report from the California Medical Board, which I will attach, and a photo that you can see here of Julia at the Trefil's property with children. This isn't just a story, it's something that can be cross-referenced. If the medical board had reports on Julia and still took no action, this is criminal negligence. If photos place Julia in close proximity to children, that's potentially even more disturbing. And this is something that can be investigated right now. Galina's words. The Mendocino County DA's office has a copy of every single document that my father kept regarding Julia. Every name that failed to catch her, they have a copy of that. That leads me to ask, so if Mendocino County has all of these documents, what have they done with them? Where are the records? Who's in charge of the investigation? Galina's case is growing in reach and controversy. More people are taking interest, including a former law enforcement officer who recently released a video kind of dissecting her claims, and he seems somewhat skeptical and acknowledges that if her father really offered to take investigators to bodies and they ignored it, that would be shocking. So we now have a former officer weighing in questions about how law enforcement handled this and even comparisons between Jon and the Zodiac killer. They do look very much alike. But here's the thing. Galina has a lot more to say. In the next few posts, she goes much deeper. She claims her father's crimes stretch back to the 60s, that he had a network of murderers, and that law enforcement knew far more than they ever admitted. So coming up next, we're going to break down a couple more of her posts where she details her father's alleged killing spree starting in the Bay Area, and the claims about his connections to the other killers, including the people she say evaded justice with his help. Is this an unraveling of a massive cover-up or something else entirely? So join me in the next one. Continue breaking down this story. Let me know if you've read it, if you are reading it, or if this is something that interests you.